A man says some of the best writing in New York is not found in movies or books or plays, but the memorials on the adopted benches of Central Park. Reading them makes you realize enormous things happen in every person's life. The man, whose name is Brian Bloom, further claims that the worst writing can be found in his own apartment, whose walls are covered with rejection letters from magazines from 12 countries and 47 states. He says when he realized what was missing in all those stories he had written, he was reduced to tears of shame. He wasn't interested in friendships and relationships. All he did was write and read and indulge in his own thoughts. He calls it a form of mental illness. But in New York, one can find his acquaintance, or his friend, or even his to-be acquaintance not more than 20 feet away. Brian too was prone to this. However, he had never crossed the street to meet someone, until he saw this woman. He goes over to where she's smoking and lights a cigarette himself, not knowing what to say. Brian can guess the woman's cigarette is either French or Spanish. Since he doesn't speak Spanish, he decides to speak in French. He begins by saying they're both exiles for smoking. She replies she doesn't trust anyone who doesn't smoke. He agrees, because those people are too fond of themselves. She continues in English and introduces herself as Ariel. He thinks of Ariel from The Little Mermaid, and gives a little speech about how fantastic the movie is. She jokingly asks if he just saw it yesterday, since he's so enthusiastic about it. He says he watched it when he was 8 years old. She smirks and concludes he watched it the day before yesterday. She wonders if they'll meet again. He says he'd love to. She tells him she's at the same place every Friday, and comes out for a smoke after lunch. He agrees to be there the next Friday. She retreats into the building. Later, Brian is on call with his dad. He relays good news of his latest rejection letter containing a sorry towards the end. This means improvement. His dad wants him to go to law school instead. Ariel is surprised to see Brian show up despite the rain. He pretends to not realize it has been raining. She wonders what kind of man she's dealing with. He claims to be a damp man, but one who's happy in his dampness. When he asks her the same question, she replies with une siren, meaning a mermaid in French. She asks him about his profession that allows him to walk about on the streets, smoking and talking to strangers. He tells her that he's a writer. She wants him to elaborate on what he writes about. He writes about various things including baseball and dogs. She finds that amusing. She learns that Brian is 24 years old. Ariel tells him she's a model, but she stopped modeling 8 years ago. She's 33 years old. Brian is disappointed to see her begin to leave, to go back to having coffee with her friends. She offers to meet him on weekdays, but she's free only between 5 and 7 in the evening. He finds that oddly specific, but decides to see her at 5 on Monday. She suggests they go to the Guggenheim Museum. Brian's new rejection letter does not contain an apology, which his mom perceives as a step backwards. At the museum, Brian is taken aback when Ariel describes a painting of a nice boat at the beach to be representing darkness and menace because there's no people in the painting. He tries to argue, saying they must be under the deck. She says there's nobody alive in America, based on the American artist's paintings. He points at one with people in it, and she says they're all ghosts too, calling the man in it a soulless jerk, the woman a prostitute, and the business owner bankrupt. When Brian disagrees strongly and calls her worldview very downbeat, she asks him to prove that America is alive. So he kisses her. He tells her he finds her accent beautiful. He is then astonished to learn that she settled in New York because she married a French diplomat who works there. He is even more surprised to know that they're still married. He had been assuming she was single. He also points out that she doesn't wear a wedding ring. She mocks him for needing a signpost for everything, like all Americans. He wonders why she didn't mention the fact that she was married, when it was established that they were both actively pursuing each other. She wonders why he didn't get the hint when she said she was only free between 5 to 7. He was, and is, still confused about the specific time slot. He had just assumed she was busy, or not wanting to meet people she barely knew at late hours. However, she claims that 5 to 7 is the time for relationships outside of marriage, according to a French proverb. Even though she insists it is not to be taken literally. He mocks the proverb and asks whether after the adultery hours the French also have time allotments for breaking other commandments, like coveting at 9:30 and worshipping false idols from 10 to noon. Ariel says it's an old tradition, and people have affairs anytime anywhere these days. But she and her husband have decided to follow this rule, to set boundaries. He asks if Ariel's husband does the 5 to 7 thing too. She says he has a mistress named Jane, who she sees occasionally at social events, and she jokes that she will probably be standing next to Jane at her husband's funeral. She apologizes for the distasteful joke, but he joins in, asking if the funeral is going to be soon. She realizes Brian is actually quite taken aback by all the information she just dumped on him. She confides that she and her husband have their own reasons for the choices they've made for their marriage. Such things are pretty normal and well accepted in her culture, and just because they're not in his culture, he shouldn't be judging them. He jokes that if Americans didn't have anything to harshly judge, they wouldn't know what to do all day. Ariel says his culture needs to grow and understand that there are other ways to look at life, and that people you marry and people you love can be different people. Brian asks if they have any children. She shows him a picture of their 2 children, whom she loves preciously. Brian makes up his mind and tells her that even though she's older, wiser, and has seen so much of the world, and even though she's elegant, beautiful, smart, and funny, he cannot be with her, because extramarital affairs are unethical in his dictionary. She tells him she respects his ethics, since she's asked him to respect hers. She adds that she'll always remember him fondly. She'll be smoking at that same nook every Friday, regardless of whether he wants to meet again or not. The following Friday, after lunch, Brian cannot focus on his work. Knowing where Ariel is, and knowing he could go to her, occupies his mind entirely. The next Friday, it hurts him to think of her lighting her own cigarette. The Friday after that, his resolution eventually breaks, and he goes to see her. She embraces him in a hug, and is jokingly offended that it took him 3 weeks. She hands him a hotel room key and asks to meet there at 5. When he reaches the hotel in the given room, with a lot of anticipation, he knocks on the door. Ariel calls him in. She pours him a glass of champagne, reminding him to look in the other person's eyes while clinking glasses. In American culture, not doing so brings 7 years of bad luck, while in French culture it's 7 years of bad sex. Brian jokes that the French one is more optimistic, because most people would give up after 5 years. Ariel admits that she is nervous around Brian, nervous like a girl around a guy. Brian kisses her, and she takes him to the room inside. They have a good time, and Brian jokes that he regrets not taking the chance of going abroad for a semester in college, because this was different and amazing for him. She shares the same feeling. Ariel calls him a natural lover, whose body beautifully expresses what's in his heart. Brian has never gotten such a compliment before. He is reluctant to let Ariel leave, but she has to attend a fundraiser at her kid's school. Hearing this reminds Brian of the kind of life she has. He is still unable to digest that. He asks her about the beginning of belief, something she mentioned when they parted 3 weeks ago. She dodges the question and reminds him that it's getting late. She tells him they'll meet on Monday at the same place. Around that time, Brian finds a lot of enthusiasm in writing. They go to the cinema together, where Ariel gets slightly annoyed by the noises made by Brian eating popcorn. She asks whether all Americans need to chomp on popcorn while watching movies. When they leave, she informs him she cannot kiss him goodbye outdoors. She can hang out with him, then take his arm, but that's all. He does not complain. Brian then tries to learn about French people and their culture. It all seems very strange to him, but he figures it's probably the same for her with the American culture. One day, as they're talking, he recalls the time he lost his virginity at Passover, a Jewish holiday where you eat unleavened bread called matzah. She asks him how the bread was. Sometimes their 2-hour intervals are calm and ordinary like this, or like the time they went remote control boating. Sometimes they are passionate and chaotic. As he's walking one day, a car pulls up beside Brian, and a man calls out to him. He invites him in the car, along with his half-eaten hot dog. He introduces himself as Valerie, Ariel's husband. As he shakes his hand, Brian apologizes for his greasy hands. Valerie also apologizes for suddenly seeking him out. He says Ariel speaks highly of Brian, which surprises him. He reiterates her compliments to him about his talent, sincerity, kindness, and charm. Valerie says he's quite pleased to see Ariel have a light in her eyes she never had before, for the short while she has known Brian. He thanks him and unexpectedly invites him for dinner at their place. Brian is still overwhelmed at this whole concept. He later confronts Ariel about the encounter. He is taken aback to know that Ariel did really tell her husband about him. However, she reveals the dinner invitation was entirely his idea. Ariel simply thinks he would enjoy being friends with such a nice man as Valerie. To Brian, this is a wildly awkward situation. He feels guilty somehow, but Ariel sees no reason to feel so, when Valerie is genuinely happy for them. She understands that Brian is still far from getting used to this stuff. She tells him to put aside his ideas of people and their behavior, and he'll be surprised with what the world has in store for him. When he arrives at their house, the housekeeper lets him in, and a handsome little boy immediately comes to get his coat. There's an elevator to take him upstairs. The elevator door is opened by Ariel's beautiful daughter. She greets him in French and welcomes him in. Valerie greets him next, and Brian jokingly asks if his cute-mannered kids are from a catalog. Valerie has also invited 3 famous personalities. However, Brian doesn't fluster. Valerie introduces Jane Hastings, and Brian recognizes the name. She's Valerie's mistress. He's unfamiliar with the setting, but everyone else, including Ariel, seem to be very used to it. They have fun chatting over dinner, and soon Brian gets comfortable as well. After dinner, Brian and Jane decide to share a taxi. He confirms that she's dating Valerie, and asks whether she feels unsure of what she's got herself into. He asks Jane if she's not worried about not having a relationship with the future. Her answer is that she's only 25, and has a lot of time for a future. She thinks everyone should try to have as many good moments as possible in their life. She's happy right now, and that's what matters. Brian argues that there's nothing that's free of consequences in this world. He was taught that you will eventually suffer tenfold when the rent is overdue. Jane recognizes he's Jewish, and gives him a popular baseball metaphor that Jewish writers love as a piece of advice, which is to swing from the heels. She also says she looks forward to the update he'll have by the time they meet again. Brian brings Ariel to a restaurant to meet his parents. This is his implementation of Jane's advice. Brian is a little bit embarrassed when his dad enters, complaining about eventually having to pay for parking. He also notices Arlene standing at her seat. He jokes that she used to send back entrees when they first met, and now she's sending back chairs. After Brian properly introduces Ariel to his parents, his dad speaks to Ariel in French, but he messes up by using an obsolete word. The couples will be watching a movie next, and he suggests they leave their car somewhere and take a taxi to the theater. Brian is annoyed by all this fuss about parking. His dad orders tap water, and his mom orders a vodka martini. His dad jokes that she'll be passed out by intermission. His parents praise Brian's French-speaking skills, even though he learned it in school and has never been abroad. Ariel agrees. They ask Ariel about herself, since Brian speaks very well of her. She immediately tells them she's 33, married, and a mother of 2 kids. At this, Brian's mom sits down, and his dad orders alcohol. Later, Brian's dad lists all of the reasons why he shouldn't be dating Ariel. They include her being a married French woman, who's older than him, and has 2 kids. He insists her Frenchness is not a major reason. On a serious note, he just hopes this relationship doesn't end up ruining his son's perfectly normal life. He asks his wife to support him on his stance, so he doesn't become the bad guy, but her opinion differs. She claims that you never fight 2 forces on Earth, which are Mother Nature and love. She thinks Ariel is lovely, and even though it's not an ideal situation, she cannot help but feel warmly towards someone who adores her son. Brian's dad says he doesn't dislike Ariel, but he also doesn't know her very well. Brian's mom, though, is clearly starstruck by Ariel's beauty and grace. Their next meeting, Ariel teaches Brian how to taste wine and recognize it. She says he has the palate of a water buffalo. Baguette is his palate cleanser between tastes. To make it even, Brian has her taste American beer, with buffalo chicken wings as her palate cleanser. They're both bad at recognizing the tastes. Their relationship develops as they keep on seeing each other. Brian finds it hard to believe that she was unattractive and had big glasses when she was younger. They also explore new things, and are more than satisfied with their sexual compatibility. Ariel is sure that one day Brian will be a popular writer, and all the people in New York will recognize him. One time, Ariel's kid's nanny is sick, and she and Valerie have to attend a state luncheon. Brian suggests he babysit her kids, Mark and Elodie, and takes them to a park and teaches them how to play baseball. The kids tell him they're very grateful that he's their mom's boyfriend, and that they are very happy to have him in the family. Brian is taken aback. When Ariel comes to pick them up, Brian proudly announces he's trained professional baseball athletes. When he gets home, there's a letter waiting for him. It's from a magazine willing to publish Brian's story, the one about dogs, with a pay of $6,000. When he tells Ariel, she's more than happy for him. She jumps up and down on the bed in excitement. Brian jokes that she probably regrets making fun of that story. She denies it, and wittily replies that it just means you can write about complete bullshit and still fool people. Jokes apart, she really is proud of him. There's a ceremony for the 6 new publishing writers for the magazine, and he wants Ariel to attend. But it's not between the hours of 5 to 7, and she insists they cannot break the rules. As Brian's parents sit through the announcement of his to-be-published story titled Run from Becky at the ceremony, his dad fusses about Ariel bringing her husband to the ceremony. Jane is there as well. Brian and his mom plead his dad to stop complaining for a bit. The story is about a forbidden liaison between 2 Westminster best-in-breds, that is, a German Shepherd and a Nova Scotia Duck Trolling Retriever. Brian's mom is a huge fan of the magazine, and has been reading it since her college days. She talks to the owner of the magazine, and also mentions having a copy of his magazine cover hanging in their guest room. The couple talk about being surprised to discover that he's a nice ma, and since they were assuming him to be a more stuck-up person in real life. Brian is embarrassed already, but the owner praises Brian's talent, and claims that even though all the 6 winning stories were terrific, Brian's story had a sense of greatness in it. Jane is overjoyed to break the news of her boss taking a liking to Brian's story and wanting to meet him. She works for the magazine company as an editor. She goes on and on about what a great opportunity this could be for Brian, since her boss wants him to start a novel, and rushes him upstairs to meet her boss. Brian's mind is however still on Ariel bringing Valerie along, so as to not break their rules. He finds it uncomfortable to see them together during his big moment, but he says nothing to her. Jane asks him to stop thinking about Ariel for a while and focus on his future. Brian meets her boss, Jonathan, who tells him to do whatever Jane asks him to during the coming years, and that he can't wait to read what Brian writes. He would be honored to publish him. Jane is quite giddy. Brian's parents get into a banter again on the same topic of his relationship. His mom reminds his dad of the difficulties they faced in the beginning of their relationship, and so they shouldn't meddle in their son's relationship, even if it seems problematic to them. Brian feels awkward when they start bringing up their old memories, and he takes his leave. Brian ponders for a while on the street, and then calls Jane. She's surprised that he's asking her for the kind of jewelry Ariel likes in the middle of the night. She tries to pry about his plans, but he doesn't tell her. The next time he meets Ariel, he tells her that he has always wanted, and still wants, to be a good writer and tell meaningful stories to the world. But what he really wants is just one thing, and that is to be the man who walks beside Ariel. And not just from 5 to 7. He gets on his knees and asks her to marry him. He would love to be her husband, and if she wants, a stepfather to her kids, and if possible, even have kids of their own. They both know it very well, but she still reminds him that she's married. He says he cannot abide by the rules anymore. He's found the person he wants to spend the rest of his life with, and his mind is set. His drive and decision is stronger than any sort of rules or doubts about the purpose of marriage. He can only take it back if his feelings are not reciprocated as strongly, but Ariel admits that they are. He knows it too. Ariel worries about him throwing away his young adult years by taking the role of a stepfather, but he insists those years are overrated. She reminds him several times of how much older she is, and that she'll be aging faster soon, but he insists he'll find her beautiful no matter what. Ariel then asks his opinion on whether staying with Valerie would be a better decision for their kids. He says if he had thought so, he wouldn't have been proposing in the first place. This whole thing is extremely complicated, yet so simple at the same time. It all comes down to what people are willing to do for love. Finally, she takes the ring from him and puts it on her finger. He asks whether this means a yes, but she says nothing. She just hugs him and tells him she loves him with all her soul. Then she asks to meet the next day at 4, at the same place. Not 5, because they are done keeping the rules. She tells him she'll bring a suitcase, and they'll live there together for a short while. Brian packs his own stuff when Valerie unexpectedly visits him. He lets him in and immediately receives a backhanded slap. Valerie is angry at him for breaking the rules and boundaries, and betraying everyone involved. He is disappointed, because he welcomed Brian and their family and trusted him. Brian says he couldn't help it, and apologizes. He says he meant no harm. Valerie calms down a little, and tries to be more understanding. He eventually says he would have done the same, if he was in Brian's place. He leaves with a check signed with $250,000 and tells Brian to take care of Ariel. When Brian reaches the hotel the next day, he receives a letter from the doorman. It's from Ariel. In the letter, Ariel talks about her younger days. She started working as a model when she was 11, and at 25, she felt her career was ending. She was terrified of what her future would be like, and hence she made an error in her decision of marriage. While some lucky girls fell in love and got married, she did not. Even though she had been to numerous places and met numerous people. When she met Valerie, she thought he was solid and reliable. She felt affection and respect towards him, which she says is a different kind of love. She thought she could only have that kind of love in her life, so she didn't believe in other kinds of love. Until she met Brian. She regrets not believing before, because when she fell in love with Brian, it was too late. It was tempting, because she had never felt so alive before. It was as if a secret door had been opened for her that carried new happiness. But painfully so, she must refuse his gift of proposal. Not because she thinks he might not be a wonderful stepfather, or because of their different lifestyles, or the age difference, or because of society, but because when she married Valerie, they wrote their own vows, and he has kept all his promises, and so, she feels she must too. She adds that it's more than a matter of honor and keeping her word. She tells him he'll understand when he has his own kids someday, that leaving them is no different than leaving yourself. And it's unthinkable to hurt them. She's old-fashioned, like she once said. She is sorry to part ways this soon. She says her decision is firm. Brian closes the letter with a heavy heart. He walks out of the hotel, after giving the doorman the letter back. He slips in the ring inside it, asking the man to hand it to Ariel when she comes there for lunch on Friday. He walks out sullenly, and almost mistakes a woman in the crowd for Ariel. However tempting, he does what she asks and never contacts her again. He avoids her areas and routes, and doesn't come by the hotel again either. Brian and Jane are co-workers and friends now. He asks Jane about Ariel's whereabouts, but she has nothing to say, because she ended things with Valerie too. Being with him felt like betraying her friendship with Brian, she says. She comforts Brian, and tells him to eat well and smoke less. Brian notices that, as little as you want to write when you're happy, the more you have to write when you're miserable. All your passions need to go somewhere, and this is the only place left. Your suffering has to be good for something. Jane blindfolds Brian to take him somewhere. She stops at the window of a bookstore, where his book titled, The Mermaid, is displayed in the new arrivals section. He stares at it, deep in thought. Jane is super excited, and drags him into a cab to go celebrate. Ariel notices the book as she walks by too. Brian is sure that whoever came up with the idea of impermanence and the beauty of change, and how inevitable change is in life, was probably just dumped by someone. Because those people realize that just because something doesn't last forever, it doesn't diminish the worth and the beauty of the memories. He thinks this way of thinking is better than mourning for what could have been. He chooses to believe in love, to believe in her, to believe that their bond was never broken, and they carry it in their hearts as a secret singularity. She made him a writer, and she made him a man. Ariel was right that even though there might be other great loves in their lives, only one remains perfect. He wonders if it remained perfect for her as well. Seems like a question that will go unanswered, but then again, in New York, one can find his acquaintance, or his friend, or even his to-be acquaintance not more than 20 feet away. So a few years later, Brian is walking down the road with his wife Kiva and their kid Charlie, when they run into Ariel and Valerie, and their kids. Brian collects himself, and introduces his wife and 2-year-old kid. Ariel tells Brian she loved The Mermaid. Valerie agrees, and they tell him his books are loved by their family. Valerie asks about Jane's well-being. Brian informs them she's married to a cellist, and they have a son as well. Brian and Ariel are lost in each other's eyes as their partners engage in light conversation with each other. Ariel takes off her glove momentarily to show him the ring she's wearing, the one he bought for her. After a few more seconds of silent conversation with just their eyes, they bid each other goodbye. Brian wonders if he'll never see her again, and if that's a good thing or not. But he promises you that whatever your favorite story might be, it was surely written for just one reader.